A modern sniper round travels faster than the human brain can understand danger. At roughly 2,800 feet per second, the bullet covers hundreds of meters in less than a heartbeat. The nervous system needs time, milliseconds, to register pain, to recognize trauma, to trigger fear. By the time Hezbollah commander Imad al-Karim realized something was wrong, the bullet had already passed through his skull. The round entered cleanly, shattered bone, and exited before sound reached his ears. His body collapsed backward against the polished teak deck of his yacht, a half-finished glass of whiskey tipping and spilling across white cushions. The Mediterranean night remained calm. The water barely moved. From the shoreline, more than 400 meters away, the sniper lowered his rifle. There was no second shot. There didn't need to be. For several seconds, nothing happened. No alarms. No screams. No return fire. The yacht drifted gently, its navigation lights glowing softly against the dark water. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like a man enjoying a quiet night at sea. Only when a bodyguard stepped onto the deck and froze did the illusion break. By then, the shooters were already moving. Hidden among rocks along the coast, the Israeli team began their withdrawal sequence immediately. The rifle was disassembled in practiced motions. Spent casings were already gone. Thermal cloaks masked residual heat. Within moments, the firing position was empty, indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Less than 2 minutes had passed since the trigger was pulled. By the time Hezbollah security units reached the marina and swarmed the yacht, Imad al-Karim was dead. By the time Lebanese authorities sealed the area, the men who killed him were already kilometers away, blending back into a system designed to leave no fingerprints. This was not an act of revenge. It was an execution ordered long before al-Karim stepped onto his yacht that night. Imad al-Karim was not a public figure. His face rarely appeared in photographs. His name almost never appeared in speeches. Within Hezbollah, that anonymity was deliberate. He was not a politician. He was not a cleric. He was an operator. For more than 2 decades, al-Karim had been responsible for planning and coordinating Hezbollah's most sensitive cross-border operations against Israel. Missile deployments, naval attack planning, logistics routes that moved weapons from Syria into southern Lebanon. He did not pull triggers himself. He designed systems that allowed others to do so efficiently and repeatedly. To Israeli intelligence, he was not just another commander. He was a node. Remove him, and entire operational chains would collapse. Al-Karim was born in the early 1970s in southern Lebanon, during a period when the region was already saturated with conflict. Israeli forces, Palestinian factions, Syrian intelligence services, and emerging Shiite militant groups all competed for influence. Hezbollah was still forming, shaped by Iranian advisors and hardened by constant confrontation with Israel. From an early age, al-Karim demonstrated what his superiors valued most: discipline, discretion, and patience. He was not impulsive. He did not seek martyrdom. He sought effectiveness. That mindset carried him upward. By the early 2000s, he had become deeply involved in Hezbollah's military wing, working closely with Iranian Quds force advisors and Syrian intelligence handlers. His role expanded beyond local operations. He helped integrate Hezbollah into a broader regional strategy, one that linked Beirut, Damascus, and Tehran into a single axis of pressure against Israel. He learned how Israel watched, and he learned how to hide. Al-Karim rarely stayed in one place for long. He varied his routines. He avoided predictable movements. He understood surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques well enough to evade them, most of the time. But he also understood power. And power eventually breeds confidence. By the late 2010s, al-Karim had begun spending time aboard a private yacht kept along the Lebanese coast. To him, it felt safe. The sea offered separation, distance, mobility. From a vessel, he could move quickly, avoid fixed locations, and enjoy privacy away from crowded urban environments. It was, in his mind, the perfect refuge. What he did not fully account for was how closely Israeli intelligence had been studying that very assumption. For years, Israeli analysts had mapped Hezbollah's senior leadership, not just by rank, but by function. who designed operations, who coordinated weapons transfers, who understood the full picture rather than isolated fragments. Al-Karim stood out. Signals intelligence tracked his communications. Human sources reported his movements. A pattern began to emerge, not rigid, but exploitable. Certain marinas, certain nights, certain habits that repeated just often enough to matter. The yacht was one of them. To Israeli planners, it represented something rare, a target isolated from civilians, away from dense urban cover, and exposed to long-range precision fire without the need for airstrikes or raids that could escalate into broader conflict. It was an opportunity, but opportunity alone was not enough. Killing a senior Hezbollah commander is not a tactical decision. It is a strategic one. It requires assessing retaliation risks, regional fallout, and the possibility of miscalculation that could spiral into war. For months, Israeli intelligence collected and reassessed. They monitored al-Karim's operational role, confirming that he remained active, that his removal would meaningfully degrade Hezbollah's capabilities rather than simply elevate a replacement. The conclusion eventually was clear. As long as Ahmad al-Karim lived, Hezbollah's ability to threaten Israel from the north would continue to grow more sophisticated, more precise, and more dangerous. And so, the question stopped being if he would be targeted. It became how. The answer would come not from the air, not from a drone, not from an explosion in a crowded street, but from a single bullet fired silently from shore, across calm water, into a man who believed the sea made him untouchable. From a moment, Israeli intelligence identified Ahmad al-Karim's yacht as a recurring refuge. The operation shifted from abstract threat assessment to concrete geometry. The sea, contrary to popular belief, does not create safety. It creates exposure. On land, a high-value target can hide behind buildings, traffic, crowds, and layered security perimeters. At sea, especially near shore, those layers disappear. Movement is constrained. Sight lines open. Distances become measurable. Every approach vector can be plotted in advance. Al-Karim believed the water insulated him. Israeli planners understood it did the opposite. For months, analysts reconstructed his maritime routines. Signals intelligence revealed when encrypted phones went silent, a strong indicator he was aboard the yacht rather than in an urban safe house. Visual intelligence from long-range optics and satellite passes confirmed docking locations and departure times. Human sources reported which marinas were favored, which crews were trusted, and how often the vessel stayed anchored rather than cruising. A pattern emerged, not rigid but sufficient. The yacht typically remained within a narrow coastal corridor, rarely venturing far from shore. That limitation was practical, not careless. Staying close allowed rapid extraction in case of emergency and kept the vessel within Hezbollah-controlled areas. It also avoided deep-water zones monitored by foreign navies. From al-Karim's perspective, it was cautious. From Israel's perspective, it was ideal. Coastal waters allow land-based engagement. Ballistic calculations become stable. Wind patterns are predictable. Shooters can operate from fixed positions rather than unstable platforms. Most critically, a shore-based shot reduces escalation risk. No aircraft crossing borders. No drones loitering overhead. No explosions to deny. Just a man, a rifle, and a line of sight. Before any operational planning began, Israeli intelligence had to answer a more fundamental question. Was al-Karim still indispensable? Targeted killing is not about symbolism. Removing a figurehead achieves little. What matters is disruption, whether the removal of a single individual fractures systems faster than they can repair themselves. In al-Karim's case, the assessment was unequivocal. He was not merely executing orders from Tehran or Beirut. He was synthesizing them. He understood missile deployment patterns, naval attack planning, and cross-border infiltration logistics as an integrated whole. He coordinated between Hezbollah units that rarely communicated directly with one another, reducing the risk of compromise while increasing operational efficiency. He was, in intelligence terms, a convergence point. Removing him would not end Hezbollah's military capabilities, but it would introduce friction delays, miscommunication, uncertainty, at precisely the levels where Israel sought advantage. That conclusion elevated the file. Once elevated, the file entered a different system entirely. Within Israel's security apparatus, decisions of this magnitude are not made by a single agency. Military intelligence, internal security, special operations command, and political leadership all weigh in. Each brings a different lens: feasibility, legality, escalation risk, and strategic timing. Several options were evaluated. An airstrike was dismissed early. Too visible. Too escalatory. Civilian casualties could not be ruled out, especially in a marina environment. A drone strike offered deniability, but not enough. Drones leave signatures, radar tracks, debris, unmistakable patterns. Hezbollah would respond publicly. The risk of rapid escalation was high. A close-range raid was considered and rejected. Boarding the yacht or intercepting Al-Karim ashore would require teams to penetrate densely controlled territory. The operational risk was disproportionate to the benefit. The sniper option remained. A single shot, fired from shore, offered maximum precision with minimal footprint. It allowed Israeli leadership to maintain ambiguity while delivering an unmistakable message to Hezbollah's inner circle. Distance and discretion no longer guaranteed survival. Once the method was selected, the problem became execution. The first challenge was geography. Israeli analysts mapped the coastline in obsessive detail. Rock formations, elevation changes, vegetation density, access routes, and escape corridors were all studied. They identified multiple potential firing positions along the shore that offered clear sight lines to the typical anchoring zones used by Al-Karim's yacht. Each position was evaluated for concealment, range, and extraction feasibility. Distances mattered. At extreme range, bullet drop, wind drift, and environmental noise introduced variables that reduce certainty. The planners sought a range that balanced concealment with near-absolute lethality. Between 350 and 450 meters proved optimal. At that distance, a trained sniper using the appropriate caliber could guarantee a kill shot while remaining far enough from the waterline to avoid detection or immediate pursuit. The sound signature would be minimal, especially against ambient coastal noise. Weapon selection followed. The rifle needed sufficient stopping power to ensure immediate incapacitation. Suppression was mandatory, not to make the shot silent. True silence is a myth, but to delay recognition and directional awareness. Ammunition selection focused on terminal effect rather than penetration alone. Every detail was optimized for one outcome. The target would not survive long enough to understand what had happened. Training began long before the night of the operation. The shooters practiced under conditions designed to replicate the environment precisely. Night firing. Variable wind. Targets positioned on gently moving platforms to simulate a yacht's subtle drift. Stress inoculation drills ensured that heart rate, breathing, and muscle control remained stable during execution. But marksmanship was only one component. The team trained extraction just as rigorously. Routes were rehearsed repeatedly. Alternate paths were mapped in case of unexpected civilian presence or Hezbollah patrols. Timing was refined down to minutes. The goal was not speed for its own sake. The goal was inevitability. Meanwhile, intelligence collection continued. Israeli analysts monitored Al-Karim's communications for any indication that he suspected surveillance. They watched for changes in routine that might suggest heightened security awareness. None appeared. If anything, he grew more comfortable. Confidence has a way of dulling instincts. On the night the operation was approved, conditions aligned. Weather was favorable. Visibility was clear. Al-Karim's presence aboard the yacht was confirmed through multiple sources. No civilians were detected within the immediate engagement zone. Final authorization was granted. The shooters moved into position hours before Al-Karim even arrived at the marina. They blended into the terrain, motionless, invisible. For them, time slowed. Waiting is the dominant skill in sniper operations, not shooting. When the yacht eased into its anchoring position and Al-Karim stepped onto the deck, Nothing outwardly changed. He spoke on his phone. He drank. He relaxed. From shore, optics locked onto him. The shooters did not rush. They waited for isolation, for posture, for certainty. This was not about speed. It was about permanence. When a moment came, the shot was not an act of aggression. It was the final step of a process that had begun years earlier, when Israeli intelligence first concluded that Imad al-Karim represented a threat that could no longer be managed, deterred, or delayed. The trigger pull was simply the visible endpoint. Everything else had already been decided. By the time Imad al-Karim stepped onto the deck of his yacht, the operation was already hours old. From the shore, the shooters had been in position since well before sunset. They had arrived separately at different times, using routes that appeared mundane and unremarkable. No sudden movements, no identifiable pattern. To anyone observing casually, the coastline was empty. That was the point. Sniper operations are not defined by the trigger pull. They're defined by everything that happens before it, and, more importantly, everything that does not happen. No radio chatter. No last-minute adjustments. No improvisation. The plan was locked. The shoreline was quiet, but not silent. Waves broke softly against the rocks. Wind moved through low vegetation. Farther down the coast, a fishing boat's engine droned intermittently. These sounds were not obstacles. They were camouflage. Through high-magnification optics, the yacht came into view long before it reached its anchoring point. Its approach was unhurried, almost casual. The vessel was not attempting to evade detection because it did not believe detection was possible. That belief had been carefully cultivated over years. Al-Karim had survived airstrikes, intercepted communications, and internal purges. He understood drones. He understood satellites. He understood urban surveillance. What he did not fully understand was land-based maritime targeting, especially when the land did not belong to the enemy, at least not officially. From his perspective, the shore was neutral space. From Israel's perspective, it was the decisive advantage. As the yacht cut its engines and drifted into position, the shooters adjusted nothing. Their rifles were already zeroed for the distance. Environmental data had been accounted for earlier. Wind had stabilized exactly as forecast. This was not luck. It was selection. Al-Karim appeared relaxed, but not careless. He was accompanied by 2 men, security, but not close protection. They remained several steps away, giving him space. On the deck, he removed his jacket, leaned against the railing, and raised a phone to his ear. That moment mattered. A man on a phone tends to still himself. Posture becomes predictable. Movement slows. Shoulders settle. The head tilts slightly to one side. From a sniper's perspective, it is an invitation, not because it is easy, but because it is final. The shooters waited. In high-risk operations, patience is often the most difficult discipline. The human instinct is to act once opportunity appears. Training exists to suppress that instinct until opportunity becomes certainty. The optics tracked Al-Karim's upper body, then tightened further. The reticle did not drift. Breathing slowed. Heart rate stabilized. There was no urgency. This was not combat. This was termination. Authorization had already been granted. Political leadership had accepted the consequences. Intelligence agencies had accepted the blowback. What remained was execution. Clean, unambiguous, irreversible. The shooter on the rifle was not chosen for aggression or bravado. He was chosen for emotional neutrality. His previous deployments had demonstrated the same pattern. No hesitation, no overconfidence, no narrative framing. To him, Al-Karim was not a symbol or a villain. He was a solution to a problem. The final check was visual confirmation of isolation. No civilians in immediate proximity. No sudden movement on the deck. No interference from the shoreline. The spotter made the call. The trigger was pulled once. There was no dramatic crack, no cinematic recoil. The suppressor did exactly what it was designed to do: reduce the acoustic signature and delay recognition. To anyone not trained to hear it, the sound blended into the coastal background. On the yacht, the effect was immediate. Al-Karim collapsed where he stood. There was no shout, no attempt to run. No moment of comprehension. The shot had been placed to ensure that the body failed faster than the mind could respond. For several seconds, no one on the yacht moved. Confusion precedes panic. Human beings struggle to process violence that does not announce itself. Then, one of the security men shouted his name. Another rushed forward. Only then did panic erupt. But panic was irrelevant. From the shore, the shooters were already disengaging. Rifles were broken down methodically, not rushed. Brass was accounted for. Equipment was packed with the same discipline used during insertion. There was no celebration, no acknowledgement of success. Emotion had no role here. Extraction began immediately, but not hastily. Moving too quickly draws attention. Moving too slowly invites interception. The pace was calibrated. Within minutes, the firing position was empty. On the water, the scene deteriorated rapidly. Security personnel attempted rudimentary first aid, but it was futile. Communications erupted. Encrypted calls, shouted instructions, overlapping orders that conflicted with one another. No one had a clear picture of what had happened. That uncertainty was by design. Hezbollah's first internal question was not who had done it. It was how. There had been no explosion, no aircraft overhead, no visible attacker, no obvious point of origin. The yacht's crew scanned the surrounding water, searching instinctively for boats or divers. They did not look to the shore. That delay mattered. Within hours, Hezbollah leadership convened emergency meetings. The assassination of a senior commander was not unprecedented, but the method was deeply unsettling. It suggested a level of surveillance and access they had not accounted for. If a commander could be killed from shore in supposedly controlled waters, then no coastal movement was safe. The psychological impact extended beyond the loss of a single individual. Trust eroded immediately. Who had leaked his routine? Which marina staff were compromised? Which security assumptions were wrong? Each question generated suspicion, and suspicion generated paralysis. Operational tempo slowed. Movements were canceled. Meetings postponed. Orders delayed pending verification. This was the true objective. Israel did not need to announce responsibility. Silence amplified the effect. Public ambiguity forced Hezbollah to speculate, and speculation is corrosive. Every possibility becomes a threat. Was it Israel alone? Was another state involved? Had someone inside facilitated the strike? No clear answers emerged. Meanwhile, Israeli leadership did exactly nothing publicly. No statements, no leaks, no confirmation. The absence of narrative allowed. The absence of narrative allowed Hezbollah's imagination to do the work. Internationally, analysts debated the implications. Some pointed to the operation as a demonstration of extreme precision. Others warned of escalation. But all agreed on one thing. The rules had shifted. The sea was no longer neutral. Within days, Hezbollah altered its maritime protocols. Yacht usage dropped sharply. Senior figures avoided coastal leisure entirely. Security measures tightened, but not coherently. Overcorrection often replaces confidence after a shock. For Israel, the operation achieved multiple layers of effect. Tactically, a key operational coordinator was removed. Operationally, Hezbollah's internal trust and tempo were disrupted. Strategically, a message was delivered, not through words, but through geometry and patience. Distance did not equal safety. Leisure did not equal invisibility. And silence did not equal ignorance. The shot itself lasted less than a second. Its consequences extended far beyond that moment. Because the most unsettling assassinations are not those that announce power loudly, but those that reveal how quietly power can be applied and how little warning precedes irreversible change. The real consequences of the assassination did not unfold on the deck of the yacht. They unfolded in rooms with closed doors, lowered voices, and men who no longer trusted the assumptions that had kept them alive. Within hours of Imad al-Karim's death, Hezbollah's internal security apparatus shifted into containment mode. Phones were seized. Movement logs were reviewed. Guards were questioned, then questioned again by different people asking the same questions in slightly different ways. This was not redundancy. It was distrust. When a senior commander is killed in a manner that defies existing threat models, the first instinct is not retaliation. It is introspection, bordering on paranoia. Hezbollah had spent years hardening itself against air power, electronic surveillance, and infiltration. It had built doctrine around drones, cyber interception, and urban concealment. What it had not done was seriously account for precision violence delivered from places it considered politically or tactically inert. The shoreline was one of those places. Al-Karim's assassination forced a reassessment that rippled outward. The organization had to confront an uncomfortable reality. Their enemy had not just found a gap. It had redefined the map. Internal reviews focused obsessively on routine. Who knew when Al-Karim would be on the yacht? How predictable were his leisure habits? Who had access to marina schedules, fuel suppliers, maintenance crews? Each question implied betrayal, even when none existed. That implication alone was enough to degrade cohesion. Commanders began limiting their exposure, not only to Israel, but to one another. Information sharing narrowed. Decisions that once took minutes now took days as layers of verification were added. Some meetings moved inland. Others were canceled entirely. Security increased, but security without clarity is often counterproductive. Armed escorts drew attention. Randomized schedules disrupted coordination. Overlapping authority created confusion about who was actually in charge of protection. This was friction by design. Israel did not need Hezbollah to collapse. It needed Hezbollah to slow down, second-guess itself, and burn energy protecting against threats that might never materialize. The assassination achieved that with remarkable efficiency. At the same time, Israeli leadership was careful not to overplay the moment. There were no follow-up strikes, no rhetorical escalation, no sudden pattern that could be mapped and countered. Silence was the strategy. Within Israel's security doctrine, there's a concept sometimes described internally as selective invisibility. It does not mean remaining unseen at all times. It means choosing precisely when visibility serves the objective and when absence does more damage. In this case, absence was devastating. Without a public claim of responsibility, Hezbollah could not calibrate its response. Retaliating blindly risked miscalculation. Doing nothing risked appearing weak. Every option carried cost. Israel understood that ambiguity shifts the burden of decision-making onto the adversary. And decision-making under uncertainty is where organizations fracture. Internationally, reactions were measured. There were condemnations as expected, but no unified call for escalation. The lack of collateral damage made the incident harder to weaponize diplomatically. Analysts debated attribution, but debate itself diluted urgency. For Israel, that outcome mattered. The operation had been designed not only to remove a person, but to avoid triggering a chain reaction. Precision was political as much as tactical. Inside Hezbollah, however, the psychological aftershocks continued. Commanders began avoiding coastal environments altogether. Maritime movement, once considered a low-risk alternative to predictable land routes, became suspect. This forced greater reliance on roads, which were easier to monitor and disrupt. Security teams expanded, but experience did not. New guards were less trained, more nervous. Nervous guards make mistakes. They misinterpret signals, overreact, and sometimes leak information unintentionally. The organization compensated by centralizing authority, but centralization creates bottlenecks. Every structural adjustment introduced new vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, Israeli intelligence watched quietly. They were not celebrating. They were measuring. Changes in communication patterns. Delays in operational planning. Shifts in command hierarchy. Each data point confirmed what planners had anticipated. Removing a convergence figure creates cascading inefficiencies that cannot be repaired quickly. Al-Karim's role had not been unique because he was irreplaceable. It had been unique because he connected systems that did not otherwise speak smoothly to one another. His absence forced those systems to interface directly, and the seam showed. There There was also a subtler effect, one that did not appear in reports or intercepts. Confidence eroded. For years, Hezbollah commanders had internalized a hierarchy of threats. Aircraft were dangerous. Drones were dangerous. Urban exposure was dangerous. The sea, near friendly shores, had been mentally coded as relief. That mental map was gone. Once safety categories collapse, stress increases exponentially. People sleep less. Judgment degrades. Risk tolerance swings wildly between recklessness and paralysis. This is not speculation. It is a documented phenomenon in organizations under sustained pressure. Israel's doctrine accounted for this. The objective was not domination. It was imbalance. From Israel's perspective, the operation validated a broader strategic principle. Modern conflict is less about overwhelming force and more about selective disruption. Removing the right node at the right moment can have effects disproportionate to the action itself. A single bullet, properly placed, not just physically, but contextually, can do what months of bombardment cannot. Importantly, Israeli planners did not view the assassination as an endpoint. It was a calibration tool. By observing Hezbollah's response, or lack thereof, they could assess thresholds. How much shock could the organization absorb before it reacted externally? How much internal disruption occurred before operational behavior changed? The answers informed future planning. In that sense, the yacht was not just a scene of death. It was a testing ground, and the results were conclusive. Hezbollah did not retaliate immediately. It adjusted, hesitated, and absorbed the loss. That restraint suggested awareness of vulnerability, not confidence. For Israel, that mattered more than public acknowledgement ever could. The operation demonstrated that even high-ranking figures, protected by geography, routine, and perceived neutrality, were not beyond reach. It also demonstrated restraint, the ability to act decisively without spiraling into uncontrolled escalation. That combination is rare, and it reshaped expectations on both sides. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a version of normal on the surface. But underneath, assumptions had shifted permanently. Every coastal glance, every quiet moment on a deck or balcony carried a new weight. Because the most powerful lesson of that night was not about marksmanship or intelligence reach. It was about illusion. The illusion that safety can be engineered through habit. The illusion that distance guarantees immunity. The illusion that enemies announce themselves before they act. Those illusions died with Imad al-Karim. And once illusions die, they do not come back. Every targeted killing carries two audiences. The first is obvious, the organization that loses a commander. The second is broader, quieter, and often more important, the state's proxies and planners who are watching closely, recalculating their own assumptions. The assassination of Imad al-Karim was never intended to stand alone. It was designed to resonate. Israel's strategic message was not delivered through speeches or press briefings. It was delivered through method, restraint, and timing. It was aimed far beyond Hezbollah's immediate leadership. At its core, the message was simple: no operational domain is inherently safe. For years, armed groups in the region had adapted to Israeli capabilities by compartmentalizing risk. Airspace was dangerous. Urban environments were risky. Electronic communications were compromised. But certain spaces, maritime leisure, neutral shorelines, low visibility routines, were treated as psychological safe zones. Israel's planners understood that these mental distinctions were as important as physical defenses. So they targeted the distinction itself. By choosing a moment of apparent calm, in a setting coded as low threat, Israel demonstrated that security was no longer about location. It was about exposure, and exposure was everywhere. That lesson was not meant only for Hezbollah. It was meant for every organization operating under the assumption that adaptation alone guarantees survival. Regional intelligence services took note immediately. Quietly, without public acknowledgement, maritime security doctrines began to change. Senior figures reduced leisure travel. Naval movements became more guarded. Even state actors reassessed how predictable patterns could be exploited without crossing traditional red lines. This was influence without escalation. Israel had not launched a strike that demanded retaliation. It had executed an operation that forced reconsideration. That distinction mattered. Within Israel's own strategic community, the operation reinforced a long-standing belief. The most effective uses of force are those that do not invite symmetrical response. Visibility is not power. Control of escalation is. The assassination showed how precision could replace volume, and how ambiguity could replace deterrence rhetoric. Importantly, the operation also signaled discipline. There was no follow-up campaign, no attempt to capitalize publicly on the moment, no chest thumping. That restraint told observers that this was not an emotional act or a symbolic gesture. It was calibrated, and calibration is unsettling to adversaries. For Hezbollah, the message was layered. On the surface, it was a warning. Senior figures remained vulnerable despite years of adaptation. But beneath that was a more corrosive implication, that Israel's intelligence penetration was deeper than previously assumed. If the timing and setting of Al-Karim's leisure could be mapped so precisely, what else was known? What conversations had been overheard? What routines logged? What internal trust misplaced? These questions lingered without answers. And unanswered questions are strategic liabilities. For Iran, watching from a distance, the implications were equally uncomfortable. Hezbollah was not just a proxy. It was a critical component of regional deterrence, demonstrating that its commanders could be removed surgically without triggering open conflict, undermined the perception of controlled escalation. It suggested that Israel retained freedom of action in spaces previously considered gray. That mattered far beyond the coastline where the shot was fired. The operation also influenced how future actions would be interpreted. After Al-Karim's death, every unexplained incident, every sudden illness, every disappearance carried added weight. Ambiguity became a persistent background pressure. Israel did not need to act again immediately. The memory of the operation did the work. From a doctrinal perspective, the assassination reflected a broader evolution in how modern states apply force. Large-scale military actions are increasingly costly, not just in resources, but in legitimacy. Precision actions, by contrast, offer control over timing, narrative, and consequence. But precision only works if it is credible. That credibility is built over years, through consistent demonstration of reach and restraint. Al-Karim's assassination fit into a pattern that signaled continuity rather than exception. It told observers this was not a one-off. At the same time, Israeli planners were acutely aware of the ethical and legal scrutiny such operations attract. The emphasis on minimizing collateral impact was not just moral, it was strategic. Civilian harm would have reframed the narrative entirely, shifting focus from capability to condemnation. By avoiding that, Israel preserved the operation's strategic clarity. The message remained intact. There was also a domestic dimension. Israeli leadership had to demonstrate to its own population that threats were being managed proactively, without dragging the country into unnecessary war. Operations like this serve that purpose quietly, without spectacle. Security, in this model, is not something you announce. It is something you maintain. For Hezbollah, the long-term impact was not immediate collapse or dramatic retaliation. It was something subtler and more damaging, a permanent adjustment of behavior. Caution replaced confidence. Redundancy replaced efficiency. Suspicion replaced trust. None of these changes make an organization stronger. They make it slower. In an asymmetrical conflict, speed and coordination are everything. Over time, these micro-inefficiencies compound. Missed opportunities, delayed responses, increased exposure elsewhere. Israel understood this dynamic well. The assassination was not about removing one man. It was about altering an ecosystem. That ecosystem now operated under a new constraint. The knowledge that calm moments were not neutral, and that safety was conditional at best. As months passed, analysts could trace downstream effects. shifts in operational tempo, changes in command structure, increased reliance on less experienced intermediaries. Each change created new points of leverage, all from a single, silent moment. The broader lesson of the operation was not technological. It was psychological. Power in modern conflict is not always about dominance. It is about uncertainty, introduced deliberately, maintained carefully, and exploited patiently. Israel's planners understood that killing al-Karim would not end Hezbollah's threat. That was never the goal. The goal was to remind everyone watching that adaptation has limits, and that the map of risk is always being redrawn. The sea had once felt like relief. Now it felt exposed. And once that feeling sets in, it does not fade easily. Long after the shoreline returned to normal, long after the yacht was towed away and the headlines faded, the consequences of that night continued to move quietly through the region. This is the paradox of modern targeted killings. The act itself is brief, almost anticlimactic, but its aftereffects are prolonged, diffuse, and often invisible. Imad al-Karim's death did not ignite a war. It did not trigger an immediate cycle of retaliation. And for Israel, that outcome was not accidental. It was the final confirmation that the operation had achieved its highest objective: influence without explosion. In the months that followed, Hezbollah adapted, as it always does. New commanders stepped in. Procedures were revised. Security layers thickened. On paper, the organization looked intact. In practice, something had changed. Decision-making slowed. Authority became more centralized, but less confident. Senior figures delegated less, trusted fewer people, and exposed themselves less frequently. That caution reduced risk in the short term, but it also reduced initiative. Organizations built for asymmetrical warfare rely on momentum. They rely on the ability to act faster than state bureaucracies, to exploit fleeting opportunities, to move before the enemy can respond. Hesitation undermines that advantage. Israel understood this dynamic intimately. The assassination was not designed to decapitate Hezbollah. Decapitation strategies rarely work against resilient, ideological movements. Instead, it was designed to apply sustained pressure, psychological, organizational, and strategic, without continuous action. In that sense, the operation functioned like a lever rather than a hammer. One pull, carefully timed, shifted the balance. There is also a broader debate, quiet but persistent, within international security circles. Operations like this force uncomfortable questions. Where does deterrence end and assassination begin? Does precision reduce moral cost, or simply repackage it? Israel has long argued that targeted killings, when conducted with strict criteria, prevent larger conflicts by removing imminent threats before they metastasize. Critics counter that normalization of such actions erodes international norms and invites reciprocal behavior. Both arguments have merit. What is undeniable is that the battlefield has changed. Geography no longer defines safety. War is no longer confined to declared zones. Influence is exerted not only through force, but through perception. And perception, once altered, is difficult to restore. For Hezbollah, the loss of al-Karim became a reference point, an internal marker of vulnerability. Every security briefing afterward implicitly referenced it. Every risk assessment asked the same unspoken question. Could this happen again? That question alone constrained behavior. For Israel, the operation reinforced a doctrine that had been evolving for decades. Act early, act precisely, and accept ambiguity as a strategic asset. Visibility is not always strength. Sometimes, the most effective action is the one that leaves no clear trace. This approach is not without risk. Ambiguity can misfire. Silence can be misread. Precision can fail. Every such operation carries the possibility of escalation, misattribution, or unintended consequence. But restraint carries risk too. Israel's leadership calculated that the greater danger lay in allowing key figures to operate with impunity, accumulating capability and confidence. The yacht, the shoreline, the moment of calm, all symbolized a belief that the threat environment had stabilized. That belief was the real target. By shattering it, Israel reintroduced uncertainty into a system that had grown comfortable. There's a temptation, when analyzing such events, to focus on the mechanics. The rifle, the distance, the timing. Those details matter, but they are not the essence of the story. The essence lies in the quiet aftermath, in the meetings that took longer than they used to, in the trips that were canceled, in the commanders who chose not to step onto a deck, or linger by the water, or assume that calm equaled safety. That is where power reveals itself, not in spectacle, but in behavioral change. For audiences watching from afar, the story offers a sobering insight into how modern conflicts are waged. Wars today are not always announced. They unfold in fragments, in isolated moments that ripple outward. A single shot can alter strategic calculations across an entire region. And yet, for all its precision and planning, the operation also underscores a deeper truth. No amount of security, technology, or vigilance can fully eliminate vulnerability. Human systems are adaptive, but they are also fragile. They depend on trust, routine, and assumption. When those erode, strength follows. Imad al-Karim's assassination did not end a conflict. It did not resolve an ideology. But it did something arguably more consequential. It reminded everyone involved that the balance of power is not static. It shifts quietly, often without warning. And it is shaped as much by what is not said as by what is done. As time passes, the specifics of that night will blur. Names will change. New figures will rise. But the lesson endures. Safety is contextual. Calm is temporary. And in modern conflict, the most decisive moments often arrive without drama, without noise, and without explanation. That is what made the shot so powerful. Not the distance, not the weapon, but the silence that followed and the way it continues to echo. If a man surrounded by security, operating near friendly shores, in a moment of leisure, can be reached so precisely, what does safety mean anymore? And if power can be applied this quietly, how many other moments we consider safe are already mapped, measured, and waiting? If you want more stories that explore the hidden mechanics of modern conflict, the operations that never make official statements, but reshape reality nonetheless, make sure to watch the next episode. Because history isn't always written in battles. Sometimes it's written in silence.